Alright guys, this is going to be the installation video for our knuckle reinforcement kits for the front axle on the TYM T25, 264, 254, and 234 model tractors, as well as the RK25. Today we have a T264, and let me go ahead and show you guys some of the issues that we're dealing with. The reason that we came out with these kits. So this tractor, we've got 184 hours on this machine, so it's pretty new. Look at the amount of slop that's already in this wheel because of the bearings that are going bad. The other side is about the same. That's wiping these things out, and it just gets worse and worse over time. Eventually, all of that slop and it beating itself to death as you're going over bumps and just general use, even just driving through a field mowing, even without a front end loader on, that's just continually watering out the bearing pockets. It's obviously hard on the bearings, and eventually it's going to lead to wallering out of the bearing pockets to where there's not even a fix for this. So once we get our kit on here, you'll be able to see that almost all of the slop, if not all of it, is taken up with our upper knuckle kit. Alright, first thing we're going to do when you get your box, unpackage everything. Make sure that you're going through every bit of the packaging material, because there's like 5 or 6 different bundles. You don't want to accidentally throw some of your parts away. You should have received one bundle that has 2 of these pipe plugs in it. Another bundle should have had a plastic bag with all of your hardware. You should have had another bundle that has your 2 inboard flanges. These are directional. They do specifically go on a left or a right side, so we'll have to make note of that. And then there should have been 2 more bundles, each with one of these. These outboard flanges, these are unidirectional, so these can go on either side of the tractor. They're completely symmetrical. We already have your uniball spherical bearing inserted, and there is a snap ring in there as well. You can kind of see that there. It's a good idea just to make sure, we've went through all of these, it's a good idea just to make sure that snap ring looks like it's completely in the groove that it's supposed to properly. But these should be all ready to go for you guys. They are not greased, but there is a grease zerk here. That'll be our very last step before putting our final cap on the top, is to get a few pumps of grease in these things. After you get your bag of parts open, it's best if you go ahead and separate everything out so you can see all of your different hardware. We did include at least one extra of almost every piece of hardware. So, you know, you have an extra nut here, extra washers, extra shims. That's just in case we screwed up or you guys mess one up or drop one down the floor drain in your shop. You should have some extra parts. For those of you that ordered extra bearings and seals, those should have been included in your order as well. If not, let me know and we'll get that squared away for you. The tools that you guys are going to need for this job is pretty straightforward. Let me go ahead and pan the camera around. Although it's not necessary, it's going to help out, speed things up if you have an impact of some kind, pneumatic or electric like this, cordless. You will need a 17mm socket to take off your wheel lugs. You're going to need a 1 1/16 socket to tighten down the main joint bolt. This is maybe the only thing that some of you guys might have to go out and get. You cannot use an impact socket for this because they're too thick to fit in there. So you need a 1 1/16 standard socket. We're going to need a 17mm wrench. And we're going to need 2 19 or 3/4 inch wrenches. You're going to need a 12mm and a 13mm socket and ratchet or wrench. Either one will work for that. And then it's always nice to have a set of vice grips and a crescent wrench. We'll need a crescent wrench or your vice grips to tighten the top cap down. Or I believe a 1-inch regular open end wrench will do that as well. after you have all of your hardware organized and your tools set out, then first thing we need to do is get the front end jacked up off the ground. Now you do not need to use a jack for this. You can use the front end loader itself by simply putting your bucket or your forks, or in this case a grapple, in the vertical orientation and just lifting up the front end off the ground. It should be noted, obviously when you're doing anything and lifting equipment off the ground, you'd be best off to put a safety block or jack stands underneath, but there's not any part of this where you should be laying underneath the tractor, so you're inherently safe if the thing should fall, or your loader would leak down, or somebody would bump the lever. We're going to go ahead and buzz this wheel off real quick. I like to just go ahead and use my wheels and tires as my jack stands. This customer's tractor actually has the backhoe on it, so I'm just going to go ahead and put it right underneath that backhoe frame. If something were to happen, there's enough room under here where there should still be 6 or 8 inches of clearance under there. I'm not getting under the tractor for any of this, so I'm not too concerned about that anyway. We're going to go ahead and just rub off the majority of any loose mud that might be on this thing. These aren't show tractors. I'm sure yours isn't either at home. All right, we're going to go ahead and take the other side off just so this axle balances out a little bit easier. I'm going to have my assistant do that, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, now that we've got both wheels off, your axle can kind of float a little bit more instead of being lifted up in the air. We can kind of manipulate it a little easier. All right, your next step is going to be taking out the top 2 bolts here, as well as the bottom one on the front. This is going to be the same on both sides. So I've already gone ahead and done that, and we've went ahead and put the new bolts in. They're the long black ones. You're not going to thread these all the way in. We only want about 1/2 to 5/8 of an inch of protrusion sticking through the front side of the hub here. We're going to need that like that in order to get this next part on. After you get those threaded in place, we're going to take 2 of each of our blue washers, 2 of each of those on the face of each of those bolts. Now you will notice the ones in the very bottom, it's a little tight. The washers will not go all the way flush against the hub. That's okay, it's pretty typical. When we put the nut on, we're going to crank the nut down, and it will smash these washers out, and we'll be just fine. All right, after we get our bolts ran through and our 2 washers in place on each bolt, the next thing we're going to do is take our large 3/4 inch bolt and our properly oriented bracket. We're going to go ahead and put that bolt through. Remember, this drop down leg is going to be facing the front. After that, we're just going to go ahead and slide it on and run your bolts, the top 2 bolts only. Let's run those all the way in until they bottom out on the back. Those top 2 bolts can be tightened up now. Now on our bottom bolt, we can start running this one in as well, but we can't run it all the way flush because we will not be able to get our nut on here. So what we're going to do right now, on this bottom one, we're just going to put the nut only, no washers at this time, because we need to crank down on it to get those 2 blue flat washers smushed into place to get everything together properly. You will probably notice that one side, likely the left side of the tractor, what would be like the driver's side, is going to be a little more tight fitting. The clearances are a little tighter on that side. than on this side. This side's going to go together pretty easy. All right, once we get that snug down, our washers have been smashed into place. We're just going to go ahead and loosen that nut back up. We're going to loosen it up, take it all the way off, and then you can continue with a blue washer, another lock nut, or a lock washer I mean, and finally our nut. Once we get that onto place, we can continue cranking down our bolt. Now you'll notice your nut is going to have some clearance issues with the hub here. So as you're cranking down that bolt, you're going to need to keep tightening the nut up a little bit, just so you don't get any binding. Then we're going to do a good final torque on our bolt. Alright, so at this point we have all three of our bolts snug down to final spec. At that point, we're going to put our washers on the other two bolts, our lock washers, and our nuts. Right now we can go ahead and crank down all three of our nuts. You may need, I don't know if you noticed, our bolt spun a little bit. You might need to use a backer wrench on the back side of your bolts to make sure that those don't spin and loosen up. Alright, so let's take an assessment of everything we've done so far. We've removed our top two bolts here on the flange on the axle and our front lower. Once those are out, we ran our bolts, our new bolts, back in with only about a 1/2 inch of thread protrusion. At that point, we can go ahead and put our nut into our inboard flange, put it in place, essentially get all of our nuts, get everything cranked down, and that puts us to where we're at right now. So the inboard flange process is pretty much done. In order to get ready for our outboard flange to go on, we need to put some shims and our seal in place here. You should have received 12 of these 3/4 inch shims. We're going to put 4 of these on our bolt, followed by our seal. We want the cup to be facing up, just like if you were eating a bowl of cereal. Same orientation, bowl up. All right, now that is ready to go. All right, we're gonna move on to our outboard flange here. This is our 12mm. You're gonna use your wrench or your socket. We're gonna remove the top 6 bolts. Okay, now that we've got all 6 bolts removed, let's give it just a quick wipe down on the flange here. Okay. Now this next part we're going to do is probably almost the most technically difficult part, because this kit was designed to have a little bit of play. There's shims all throughout this system that allow a little bit of user adjustability. If there happen to be some casting variance or machining variation between the castings, it allows a little bit of play to make sure that we're getting this thing actually centered over the axles of spindle rotation. So that's why we had 2 washers on the inside of this flange here. That way if we need to remove some or add some, we can take those washers out or add more, but there's 2 there. That way we can take them out if this needed to be moved back, if it didn't happen to be in the correct orientation. This should be close for all tractors, but there is some room for some alignment. The same is true with this outboard hub. This outboard hub sets 2 washers deep, which is about 1/8 of an inch, off of the face of the hub. Holding all of those washers in place, especially since there's 2, you wouldn't be able to do by hand. So, the little trick that we're going to use is to take your grease gun and a few dabs of grease, and we're just going to put a little dab on each one of these bolt holes on the face. Not necessarily inside of the hole, just on the face. And what this is going to do, it's obviously sticky, and it's just going to hold our washers in place. All right, now that we've got that, we should have around 40 of these little red washers. Let's go ahead and take one, put it on each hole. Then again, we're going to apply a little bit of grease to our next set of washers because these do need to be 2 washers thick. All right. Let's go ahead and get our hands cleaned off, and we'll come back here in a second for the outboard flange assembly. All right, all of our washers are in place. Our hands are cleaned up a little bit. We're going to go ahead and grab our outboard flange. These are unidirectional. It doesn't matter which side, they're completely symmetrical, so you can put either one on either side. We're going to grab our flange, and we have, some of you guys received black flange bolts like these. Some of you received red bolts. They are the same though. You should have got, I think, 13 of them, 1 extra. Those are going to be what holds our outboard hub on. All right, regardless of it, whether you have the black flange bolts or the standard red bolts, we're going to start by putting a lock washer on and a standard flat washer on each one. So let's go ahead and get all 6 of those set up. All right, we've got all of our hardware for us and ready to go. We are ready to go ahead and mount our outboard flange. First thing you're going to do, making sure that your shims, 4 shims here, are in place properly and your seal facing up. We're going to go ahead and put the uniball in first. Now before we get started, it is something to note that these 2 right here are going to be the most important to get lined up first. These are the only 2 that you can't access from the outside at all. These you can kind of access them a little bit to move them around. These are going to be the main ones we're going to focus on first. And it's going to help you if you go ahead and twist the ball so it's oriented toward the inside like this. That way we can actually put it on at a little bit of an angle. You don't want to be trying to put it on straight down because you'll knock all your washers off. Okay, at this point, we've got her in place. Our washers are still mostly there, but they've probably shifted a little bit. We're going to use our screwdriver or our nail or a small piece of wire to line up our washers with our bolt hole. As soon as you get one set in place, go ahead and at least get your bolt through so those washers don't have a chance of falling back out. You guys may find that you need to do a little bit of tapping or coercion, usually not much, just to get your bolt holes lined up. It should be a fairly tight fit, obviously. We're trying to take slop out of the system. We don't want slop in it now. So You should have to fight just a little bit to get all your bolts to line up. You do want to be pretty careful in this step to make sure that you're not cross-threading something. If it's not lining up perfectly, you don't want to be cross-threading these bolts as they're going in. Now that we've got them all, the thread started on all of them, we're just going to barely snug them, because we need to do some checking next. I'm just tightening these enough to where the washers are basically touching the lock washer. Now, pretty quick indication of whether or not this thing's lined up properly is just kind of visually looking down in here at our bolt and making sure it's looked like it's fairly aligned with the center of our bore. Now, that's going to be a little easier to see if we just temporarily take our nut and put on top. And then we can kind of look and see if it looks like there's a whole bunch of extra space on one side of the nut or the other. It doesn't have to be perfect. That's what the uniball spherical bearing in here is for, to create some slack for any deviation. But we want it to be as close as we can get it. Now, you can keep changing and manipulating this as much as you need in order to get this close. You can remove washers here, you can remove washers here, you can add, and you can keep moving around. There are slots on this outboard flange as well if it needed to be moved front to back. But what we're going to do now that we've kind of quickly looked at it, this is a little tight in the back and a little loose in the front, but we don't have our outboard bracket tightened all the way down. I think once we tighten that down, it's going to push this in a little bit and give us a little more proper clearance all the way around. So let's crank these bolts all down, see where we're at. Okay guys, right here I'm kind of looking at it and I'm realizing that this outboard flange needs to come out a little bit more. So instead of the 2 washers that are currently there, we're going to go ahead and take this whole outboard flange off. I'm going to use the grease trick again, put 3 washers on this time, and put it all back together again. If you were looking at it before, the nut on top was a little bit tight toward the inside and loose to the outside. If that's the case, then you just need to add another washer. Now this is definitely going to be a little bit tight. You know, the whole point of putting this on here is to tighten up the slop in this front axle, so it's going to take a little manipulation to get it right, but just stick with it. Use a little pick or a tapered punch or a screwdriver to help line those washers up. And I will say, if you're somebody that has maybe you're older and you have some finger dexterity issues, it would probably be helpful to have somebody come and help you with this step, just because those washers are so small. So that's what we did here. We went ahead and swapped that out with the 3 washers, and then you'll see the rest of the video here. Okay, we just took the whole kit off. We added 3 washers versus 2 on this outboard flange to bring it out a little bit. I won't sugarcoat it. It is a little bit difficult to try to get all 3 washers to stay in there while you do it. You can do it, but you might have to get a little bit crafty. Sometimes you might have to take a wrench or a screwdriver and pry on the outboard flange. You can kind of push the washers up underneath of here. Just stay patient with it and stay at it. It is possible. We've got this side on. It took maybe 5 minutes of finagling here, but we've got all the washers on, and we're going to test fit it here. You can already see that it looks like there's a little more clearance here for our nut. So that looks pretty good. It might change a little bit as well when we really crank this down. Everything will get pinched together, and we'll be able to see a little bit better then. So at this point, we're going to go and take 2 more of our shims, put down on our big bolt here. Make sure those make it all the way to the bottom and they don't get jammed up sideways. After that, we can stick our nut on. Now I still have these bolts here mostly loose, pretty much just hand tight, because we want to see what's going to happen when we crank this bolt down. Now I will say, if you're doing this part by hand, this is a nylock nut. It will be a little bit fun if you're doing it by hand. It's a big nut, and you will have to have an additional 1 7/8 wrench on the bottom, or as we went back to in the beginning, you can crank the wheel to one side if you absolutely have to. Use a pair of pliers, vice grips, just to hold that bolt enough from spinning to where you can get this top tightened down. We're going to see what we can do with the impact. I think we can pretty much close it up and get it tight with just the impact. Alright, we are going to be required to use our vice grips here, so we're going to crank the wheel all the way to the right. Now I'm using these tools because it's pretty unlikely that a lot of you guys are going to have a 1 1/8 inch wrench. Most wrench sets only go to about 1 inch. This will work just fine for just doing this one bolt on each side. That right there is the reason that you will only be able to use a standard socket and not a impact socket. There's just not enough clearance in there. Alright, now that we've got that bolted down, we need to check our clearances everywhere. Right now we've got the wheel cut all the way to the right. The main clearance you're going to look for on the back side here is in between the bottom of this flange and this flange, this inboard flange here. It's going to be tight, but make sure you can see light through it and it doesn't look like anything's rubbing. Once we check that, we're going to move it back around to the other side. We're going to check clearance here, same thing. You're going to find that the front generally has quite a bit of clearance and the back is going to be pretty tight. Just make sure nothing's rubbing and you'll be set. At this point, we're going to go ahead and crank down our outboard flange bolts. We're going to do a visual inspection, make sure that we tightened all of our bolts down. Make sure everything looks good here. You'll notice your seal on the underside may be a little scrunched up. You might have to take a small flathead screwdriver or pick and just kind of work it out of that cup so it pulls back down and is seated properly all the way around. Look for any physical clearance issues. Make sure you have clearance on the inside of your socket here. I'm going to crank the wheel back to the other side. Everything checks out on this unit.
You're almost to the pond, ain't you?
Alright guys, at this point of the video, we're pretty much done. We've checked all of our clearances, we made sure all of our bolts are tight, everything looks good. We're going to go ahead and take our big stainless cap.
Don't you probably right beside that. He's the last lucky one bought the lot that joins the pond.
Give it a little crank. You don't have to go crazy here. Let's put the wheel back on. Alright guys, at this point, we've checked to make sure all of our hardware is tightened down. Make sure we have clearance everywhere. It all looks good. We got a few final steps. Last thing we need to do is grease our insert here. Now this is not going to take a lot of grease, just a couple pumps. Do this without the cap just so you can look down in here and make sure that the grease is actually coming out. Alright, I'm seeing grease coming out. Top and bottom. It's not going to hurt. If you got any extra grease, just go ahead and stick it right down in that hub. Now that we've got grease in there, we're going to go ahead and put our cap on. Give it just a little crank. Now we can put the wheel back on. All right, wheels on. Here's our final test. You saw what it looked like, how much slop was in the system before. And this is after. There's a tiny, tiny, tiny bit, but 95% of what was there before is gone. Awesome. All right, guys, that's all there is for the installation. The other side is going to be the exact same procedure. If there's any issues or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. And check out our website for any other products that we'll be having coming up in the future. Appreciate any reviews you guys can leave, and again, let me know if there's anything that I can help with moving forward. I hope to see these guys helping you out, and once again, thank you for your order.